What did working ranchers from 1850 through 1950 put on their horses' hooves that worked better than most of the products on the shelf at your local feed store today? And why is that same product sitting in your kitchen cabinet right now for about $2 a bottle? The answer is raw linseed oil. And before you click away because you've seen hoof care videos before, I want to tell you what this one covers that most of them don't. The specific chemistry of why linseed oil works at the cellular level of the hoof wall. The exact ranch recipe that combined 3 ingredients into a dressing that held up through 6 months of hard use in the Southwest. The one version of linseed oil you must never put on a horse, and what the commercial hoof care product industry would prefer you never learn to read on a label. I've kept horses on a working property in central Tennessee for going on 18 years. In that time, I've spent more money than I care to calculate on commercial hoof products that promise moisture retention, antimicrobial protection, and restored growth from the coronary band. Some of them work. Most of them work about as well as raw linseed oil from the grocery store at a fifth of the cost. My farrier, a man named Dale Greer who has been shoeing horses in this county for 31 years, introduced me to linseed oil the way you'd introduce someone to gravity. Like it was a fact that should be obvious to everyone. Near the end of this video, I'm covering the specific 3-ingredient formula that old-time ranch hands mixed in the Southwest. The one that my grandfather used on working quarter horses in East Texas through the 1960s, and the proportions that make it work in both dry and wet climates. That formula has never been on a bottle with a brand name on it. Linseed oil and flaxseed oil are the same product from the same plant. Raw linseed oil, the food-grade product in a clear bottle in the grocery store, is pressed from flax seeds without chemical treatment. It costs about $2 for a 16-ounce bottle at most grocery stores, roughly the size of a standard water bottle. Boiled linseed oil is a completely different product, and I want to be direct about this before anything else in this video. Boiled linseed oil is not actually boiled. It is raw linseed oil, to which metallic dryers have been added, typically lead, manganese, or cobalt compounds, to accelerate drying time. Boiled linseed oil is used in woodworking, painting, and industrial applications. It is toxic. Do not put boiled linseed oil on your horse's hooves, your horse's skin, or anywhere near a horse that might lick or ingest it. The product you want is labeled raw linseed oil or food-grade linseed oil. In the grocery store, it is sold as flaxseed oil in the cooking oil section. In farm supply stores, it is sold as raw linseed oil in the paint section, though the farm supply version may not be food grade and may have additives. The safest sourcing is the cooking oil section of any grocery store. Cold-pressed flaxseed oil in a dark bottle is ideal because it hasn't been heat-treated in a way that degrades the fatty acid profile. That fatty acid profile is the reason linseed oil works on hooves, and understanding it changes how you think about hoof moisture management entirely. A horse's hoof wall is not wood. It's not leather. It's a specialized keratinized tissue composed of roughly 93% protein, primarily alpha-keratin, arranged in parallel tubules, with about 2 to 3% lipids and the remainder water. The tubular structure is the key to understanding how anything penetrates the hoof wall at all. Each tubule runs from the coronary band at the top of the hoof to the ground surface, roughly 3 to 4 inches in length, about the same distance as from your wrist to the first knuckle of your index finger. The intertubular horn material between the tubules controls moisture exchange into and out of the hoof. The outer surface of the hoof wall is covered by the periopal, a waxy glycoprotein layer that acts as the primary barrier to moisture loss in dry conditions and moisture gain in wet conditions. When the periopal is intact and the hoof wall lipid content is adequate, the hoof maintains healthy moisture balance naturally, without any intervention. When the periopal is damaged by repeated wetting and drying cycles, harsh chemical hoof treatments, or mechanical abrasion from sand and gravel, the hoof wall begins losing moisture faster than it can be replaced from internal circulation. The result is a brittle, cracked hoof wall that chips at the toe, quarters, and heel. Linseed oil addresses this at the lipid level. The primary fatty acid in raw linseed oil is alpha-linolenic acid, an omega-3 fatty acid that makes up roughly 50 to 60% of linseed oil's composition. When applied to the hoof wall surface, alpha-linolenic acid penetrates through the intertubular horn spaces because its molecular structure is small enough to pass through the lipid bilayers in the horn tissue. Once inside the hoof wall, it integrates with the existing lipid fraction of the horn, improving the flexibility and moisture retention of the intertubular material. This is not a cosmetic effect, it is a structural one. The hoof wall with adequate lipid content is measurably more resistant to cracking than a lipid-depleted hoof wall, and linseed oil replenishes that lipid fraction directly. The University of Tennessee College of Veterinary Medicine has published on the lipid composition of equine hoof horn and the mechanisms of moisture loss, and the findings are consistent with what old-time ranch use of linseed oil has demonstrated empirically for over 150 years. The fatty acid profile of linseed oil matches the native lipid fraction of the hoof wall closely enough to be directly useful. The title of this video uses the word banned, and I want to address that directly, because it's not precisely accurate and your intelligence deserves more than a clickbait frame without an explanation. No professional farriery organization has banned linseed oil. No regulatory body has restricted it. What is true is that linseed oil has no commercial profile in the modern hoof care market, and the modern hoof care market is worth hundreds of millions of dollars annually. Farnam's Horseshoer's Secret Hoof Supplement runs about $28 per gallon at Tractor Supply Co. Hoof Flex Gel runs about $18 per jar, roughly 8 ounces, about the size of a large peanut butter jar. Venice Turpentine, a traditional hoof hardener, runs about $14 for a 16-ounce bottle. Raw linseed oil from the grocery store runs about $8 for 32 ounces. The product that costs $8 for 32 ounces and has a 150-year track record on working horses is not featured prominently in any commercial marketing because there is no margin to support the marketing. This is not a conspiracy. This is basic economics. A product that costs almost nothing to manufacture is available at every grocery store in America and works as well or better than specialized commercial products, generates no incentive for a commercial enterprise to promote it. Dale Greer, my farrier, puts it more plainly. Nobody gets a commission on the flaxseed oil in your kitchen cabinet. The farriers who are skeptical of linseed oil are usually farriers who learned their trade from a curriculum influenced by commercial sponsors who sell hoof products. The farriers who grew up around working cattle operations in Texas, New Mexico, and Wyoming in the 1950s and 1960s would find the entire skepticism confusing. They didn't have a choice but to make do with what was available, and what was available worked. Before covering application, the limitation I want to name clearly. Linseed oil is a moisture management and lipid supplementation tool. It is not a treatment for active disease. Thrush, the anaerobic bacterial infection of the frog and sulci, requires an antimicrobial intervention. Copper naphthenate, which is what Copertox contains, is a documented antimicrobial against the Fusobacterium necrophorum bacteria, primarily responsible for thrush. Bleach dilutions, iodine, and commercial thrush treatments containing chlorhexidine or copper sulfate address active thrush infection in ways that linseed oil does not. If your horse has active thrush, treat the thrush first with an appropriate antimicrobial. Linseed oil after the fact, once the infection is resolved, supports hoof wall integrity and creates a less hospitable surface environment for reinfection, but it does not kill active bacteria. White line disease, a fungal and bacterial invasion of the white line area that separates the hoof wall from the laminae, similarly requires debridement and direct antimicrobial treatment before any surface application is useful. Linseed oil applied over active white line disease may trap moisture in the damaged tissue and worsen the condition. The appropriate sequence for both thrush and white line disease is diagnose, debride if necessary, treat the infection with an appropriate product, allow the treated area to dry fully, and then begin a linseed oil maintenance program on the healthy hoof wall. A horse with healthy, well-managed hooves that are beginning to show early dryness and superficial surface cracking from seasonal dry conditions is the ideal candidate for a linseed oil protocol. A horse with active infection, severe cracking that extends into the sensitive laminae, or a hoof abscess needs veterinary or farriery intervention before any surface product is applied. Application is where most people get linseed oil wrong, and getting it wrong produces results that look fine but don't penetrate deeply enough to make a lasting difference. The sequence matters more than most sources explain. Start with a clean, dry hoof. Pick out the sole and frog thoroughly. Remove any packed debris from the sulci with a hoof pick, and use a stiff brush to remove any surface mud or grit from the hoof wall. The hoof wall does not need to be washed with water before application. In fact, applying linseed oil to a wet hoof wall seals surface moisture in a way that can promote soft, overhydrated horn that is more susceptible to bacterial colonization rather than the firm, well-hydrated horn you're after. Dry hoof wall, clean of debris, is the starting condition. Warm the linseed oil before application if you're working in cold conditions. Room temperature linseed oil in January in Tennessee is viscous enough to sit on the surface rather than penetrating. Warming the bottle in warm water for 10 to 15 minutes makes the oil fluid enough to penetrate the tubular horn structure meaningfully. Some ranchers heated it more aggressively, but there's no benefit to heating beyond about 100 degrees Fahrenheit, roughly the temperature of a warm bath, and overheating can degrade the fatty acid profile you're trying to deliver. Apply with a natural bristle brush, not a synthetic brush, because synthetic bristles don't hold and release oil consistently. Paint brushes work. Old stove brushes work. Dedicated hoof brushes from farm supply stores work. Start at the coronary band, where the hoof meets the skin of the pastern. The coronary band is where new hoof wall originates, and oil applied here wicks down through the newly forming horn as it grows. Work from the coronary band downward across the entire outer surface of the hoof wall. Pay particular attention to the heel bulbs and the heel quarters, which are the areas most prone to drying and cracking in horses on dry, stony ground. Apply a second coat immediately after the first. You're not trying to build up a surface film. You're trying to saturate the surface enough that the oil is available to wick into the tubular structure. Wipe off any excess pooling at the hairline or in the clefts of the heel after 5 minutes. For a horse starting a new linseed oil protocol on dry, brittle hooves, 3 applications per week for the first month, then weekly maintenance, is the schedule Dale Greer recommends and the one I've used on horses coming off dry summer pasture in late September. For maintenance on hooves in good condition through the year, once per week is adequate in dry climates, and once every 2 weeks is adequate in wetter climates where natural moisture absorption is less of a limiting factor. The formula my grandfather used on working horses in East Texas through the 1960s was not unique to him. Versions of the same mixture appear in farrier manuals from the 1880s and ranch management guides from the early 20th century, and the proportions cluster around the same ratios with modest regional variations. Equal parts raw linseed oil, pine tar, and neatsfoot oil mixed together in a lidded container produces a hoof dressing that the old-time ranchers called simply black dressing or hoof dressing, depending on who you asked. Raw linseed oil, the base carrier and primary lipid supplement, already covered in detail. Pine tar, a thick, dark brown liquid distilled from the wood of pine trees, specifically the heartwood rather than the bark. Pine tar has been documented in medical and veterinary literature since the 18th century as an antimicrobial and wound healing agent. The phenolic compounds in pine tar, primarily cresols and guaiacol, are antimicrobial against the bacteria responsible for thrush and soft rot in hoof tissue. Pine tar also increases the adhesion of the mixture to the hoof wall surface, slowing the rate at which it wipes off on bedding and pasture. It contributes a mild hardening effect to the horn that counteracts the softening effect of the oil component in very wet climates. Neatsfoot oil, rendered from the leg bones and feet of cattle, specifically the metacarpals and metatarsals, the same leg bones used in soup stock. Neatsfoot oil is composed primarily of oleic acid and palmitoleic acid, fatty acids that are highly compatible with the lipid-rich connective tissues of animal origin. It has been used since at least the 15th century as a leather conditioner, and the same properties that preserve leather, penetrating the collagen matrix and restoring flexibility, translate directly to the keratinized horn of the hoof wall. The combination of 3 lipid sources with complementary fatty acid profiles and the additional antimicrobial function of pine tar produces a dressing that addresses moisture balance, lipid supplementation, surface antimicrobial protection, and mechanical adhesion in a single product. A 32-ounce batch using roughly equal thirds costs about $12 to $14 in materials from a farm supply store, enough for approximately 4 months of weekly treatment on 4 horses. The commercial equivalent, a branded hoof oil with similar claimed properties, runs $18 to $28 for 16 ounces, roughly half the volume at double or triple the cost. Climate is the most important variable in hoof care and the one that most generic hoof product advice ignores. In the high desert Southwest, Arizona, New Mexico, and the dry parts of West Texas, hoof moisture loss is the dominant problem. Horses on dry, sandy soil lose periopal integrity faster than horses in any other regional context, and the linseed oil protocol needs to be run year-round, not just seasonally. In these climates, neat's foot oil can be increased to about 40% of the three-ingredient mixture, because the oleic acid in neat's foot oil penetrates slightly more deeply and persists longer than linseed oil under conditions of extreme low humidity. The pine tar component can be reduced slightly because antimicrobial pressure from wet conditions is lower. In the Pacific Northwest, Oregon and Washington, where horses may stand on wet ground for months at a time, the protocol is reversed. Overhydrated hooves are as problematic as underhydrated ones because soft, waterlogged horn tissue is more susceptible to bacterial infiltration and mechanical breakdown at the toe and quarters. In consistently wet climates, the pine tar component of the three-ingredient mixture should be increased to 40 to 45%, and application frequency should be reduced to avoid adding excess moisture to already hydrated hooves. In very wet climates, a product called Venice turpentine, which is a thick resin extracted from larch trees, is sometimes added to the mixture at about 10 to 15% of the total volume as a hardening agent. Venice turpentine was a standard component of hoof packing mixtures used by cavalry veterinarians in the 19th century and is still available from specialty equine suppliers at about $14 per 16-ounce bottle. In the Midwest and Upper South, where seasons alternate between dry summers and wet springs, the balanced one-third, one-third, one-third formula applies year-round with the frequency adjusted seasonally, weekly through dry summer months, every 2 weeks, or as needed through wet winters. The horses in Central Tennessee that I manage get the full 3-application per week protocol starting in late September, when the summer dry season ends and the transition to fall pasture begins. By November, they're on weekly maintenance, and their hooves going into winter are measurably different from the same horses in years when I didn't start the protocol early. The cost math over 5 years on 4 horses makes the commercial product approach look like a choice that nobody would make if they ran the numbers. 4 horses, weekly hoof oil application, using a mid-range commercial product at $22 for 16 ounces, at 1 application per week per horse, using roughly 1 ounce per hoof per application. That's 16 ounces per week across 4 horses, or 1 bottle per week. 52 bottles per year at $22 per bottle, $1,144 per year. Over 5 years, $5,720 in hoof oil. The 3-ingredient ranch formula, at about $13 for a 32-ounce batch, using the same volume per application. One 32-ounce batch lasts 2 weeks across 4 horses. 26 batches per year, at $13 per batch. $338 per year. Over 5 years, $1,690. The difference over 5 years is $4,030. That's not nothing. And that's the conservative comparison, using a mid-range commercial product rather than the premium branded products that run $30 to $40 per bottle. If you're running 6 horses instead of 4, the commercial product cost over 5 years exceeds $8,500. The ranch formula over 5 years on 6 horses, about $2,500. Nobody presents you with a 5-year projection when you buy a bottle of commercial hoof oil at the feed store checkout. They don't have to. If this kind of practical, documented horse care content is useful to you, subscribe. Every week I cover working horsemanship with real numbers and real methods from an active horse property in Central Tennessee. No product sponsorships, no paid integrations, just what actually works. Sourcing the ingredients correctly matters more than most people expect. Raw linseed oil from the grocery store in the cooking oil section, labeled flaxseed oil, is the safest and most consistent source. Look for cold-pressed, unrefined versions in dark bottles, which indicates the oil hasn't been exposed to heat or light long enough to begin oxidizing. Oxidized linseed oil develops a rancid smell and the fatty acid profile degrades, reducing its effectiveness. Refrigerate after opening and use within 3 months. Pine tar is available from most farm supply stores in the livestock care section. It is sold as a livestock wound and hoof product, sometimes labeled pine tar for livestock. Do not substitute wood tar, coal tar, or creosote, which are different products with different chemical compositions, and some of which are toxic. Stockholm tar, A pine tar product from Scandinavia, is widely considered the highest quality form available and can be ordered online from specialty equine suppliers. It is more expensive than domestic pine tar, roughly $18 to $22 for a 32-ounce tin, but the phenolic compound concentration is higher and the consistency is more suitable for mixing. Neatsfoot oil is available at farm supply stores in both pure neatsfoot oil and neatsfoot oil compound. Buy pure neatsfoot oil. Neatsfoot oil compound is a blend that typically includes mineral oil or other petroleum-derived products, and mineral oil does not penetrate the horn tubules the same way natural fatty acid-based oils do. Pure neatsfoot oil is usually labeled accordingly and runs about $8 to $12 per quart. Mix the 3 ingredients in a metal or glass container with a lid. Plastic containers can absorb the pine tar over time and become difficult to clean. A wide-mouth glass jar with a tight lid, roughly quart size, about the size of a large mason jar, holds enough for 2 to 3 weeks of treatment on 4 horses. Shake or stir before each use, because the components have slightly different densities and will separate over time in storage. There's a parallel worth mentioning, because it connects what you're putting on the outside of the hoof to what you can do from the inside at no additional cost if you're already managing the rest of the horse's diet. Horses fed whole flaxseed or ground flaxseed as a dietary supplement show measurable improvements in hoof quality over a 90 to 120-day period. The alpha-linolenic acid in flaxseed that penetrates the hoof wall when applied topically is the same compound that, when fed, becomes available through the bloodstream to the dermal papillae of the coronary band, where new hoof horn is formed. Horses on flaxseed-supplemented diets show faster hoof growth rates and improved horn density compared to horses on the same base ration without flaxseed supplementation, according to equine nutrition research from Rutgers University's Equine Science Program. The practical note: whole flaxseed is cheaper than ground flaxseed, but must be processed before feeding, either ground or cooked, because the hull of whole flaxseed is largely indigestible to horses and passes through without releasing the oil. Ground flaxseed, fed at about half a pound per day for a 1,000-pound horse, roughly the weight of a standard bag of flour for the whole weekly ration, is the practical dosing recommendation from the Rutgers research. Flaxseed from a local grain elevator or bulk food supplier costs about 50 to 80 cents per pound, making a week's supply of flaxseed supplementation for one horse about $2.50 to $4. The combination of topical linseed oil application and dietary flaxseed supplementation addresses hoof quality from both directions simultaneously. The topical application manages the existing hoof wall, and the dietary supplementation improves the quality of new horn as it grows from the coronary band downward. The exact formula my grandfather used in East Texas, which I found written in his handwriting on the inside cover of a Farrier manual from 1962, reads as follows: 1 part raw linseed oil, 1 part Stockholm pine tar, 1 part pure neatsfoot oil. Warm the linseed oil slightly before mixing. Combine in a tin container and stir until uniform. Apply warm. The only addition he noted below the recipe was this: in dry summer, add a spoonful of beeswax melted into the mixture to help it adhere in heat. In wet winter, add more pine tar. That's the full formula as he wrote it. It cost him almost nothing because the linseed oil came from the kitchen, the pine tar was a standard ranch supply, and the neatsfoot oil was rendered from cattle they processed themselves. The beeswax came from his own hive boxes. The working horses on that property went through every year of his operation with hooves that his farrier described, in a letter I have from 1971, as the best conditioned hooves he saw on any working horse in the county. That farrier was not recommending a product. He was reporting what he observed. The horses worked cattle 12 months a year on hard, rocky East Texas ground. They were reshod every 6 to 8 weeks, roughly the standard interval that allows adequate hoof growth before the next set. And in 30 years of operation, my grandfather never had a horse pulled from work due to hoof failure. I can't prove linseed oil was the reason. I can tell you it was part of a consistent program on those horses for 30 years, and the results were consistent for 30 years. That's about the best proof that exists for any management practice you can't run a controlled trial on. None of this information is new. It's older than anyone watching it. What's new is that the context around it has changed. There are now hundreds of commercial products competing for your attention and your feed store budget, and every one of them was developed to replace something that already worked. Some of them are genuine improvements, some of them are not. The way you tell the difference is to understand what the original solution was, and why it worked, and then decide whether the new product does something the original couldn't, or whether it's the same thing in a bottle with a label. For most commercial hoof oils, it's the latter. $2 at the grocery store, a jar of pine tar, and a bottle of neatsfoot oil. Your grandfather's horse program, available today.